So today we are going to look at block 2 in the Rock the Casbah collection. What I've got here is my polymesh cutaway stabilizer, and I like using the polymesh because it is soft enough to not impede the design. I'm going to start by laying down a layer of embroiderer's felt, and then we return the hoop to the machine so that we can stitch the first colorway. Now that first colorway is going to hold down the embroiderer's felt, and then we are going to trim away the excess. We want to do this so that there is no bulk left in our seams, and it will make it so much easier for us to pull the or to put all of the blocks together at the end of the project. So we're going to come through and trim, and of course we've done this with wash away thread so that there won't even be the bulk of the extra stitching able to see. Trimming through, and once we've finished trimming, we are going to take our 100% cotton fabric, preferably starched and pressed, lay it on top, and we are ready to stitch colorway, which is going to stitch a line to hold the embroiderer's felt and the homespun cotton into our hoop. If you need to, smooth out as you go, but ideally we would have already pressed this fabric and possibly even starched it if it is a particularly soft one before you begin. And once that stitching is secure, I'm then going to come through and change to my next thread, and this is just the thread that matches the fabric that I'll be using for the applique in this particular block. And we are going to stitch the outline to show where that applique fabric is going to be placed. Now I can see that you might be having trouble seeing what I'm doing here, so I'm just going to turn those lights off to make it easier for you to see. That's a smoother look. So I'm stitching on a relatively low speed today, and the reason that I'm doing that is to make sure that the camera doesn't get too wobbly for you guys. Now this is a really large applique shape, and remember with block 2 we actually have 4 blocks to create that tube. And from there we are going to come through. Now this fabric doesn't really have a right and a wrong side, so just use your best judgment. But what we want to do is make sure that we are about 1/4 of an inch overhang on over the edge of the fabric, and that is just because our fabric is going to suck in as we create the stitching. And colorway 3 is going to come through and hold that fabric down. So now that the fabric is laid down, you actually have a choice. I like to leave the fabric untrimmed until I've done the detail stitching over the top of the fabric. And what I find is that just means that if there is any sucking in, the fabric is there to compensate for it. Alternatively, if you don't like doing that, trim around before you begin colorway 4, which is going to do a decorative stitch over our applique fabric. Okay, so that has just completed the stitching within the embroidery, and as you can see there, that is just looking beautiful. So what we now want to do is come through and trim, and you can see that I am leaving my hoop on the most flat surface that I have, which for me is my embroidery machine table, and I'm going to come through and trim all around those blocks. Now, once again, remember, we are leaving this extra material here for when the fabric sucks up with all the extra stitching we are going to do. And you'll see at the end of the design why that is important. Okay, so I'm just going to speed up our trimming a little bit so that you're not sitting there watching me cut something for 5 minutes. Do take your time as you stitch around this design. It is better to get it correct the first time. And what you will notice is I'm just coming in and around and keeping the fabric absolutely flat as I go around. Do not do this on your knee. You will start distorting the fabric, and we need to keep things as flat and as taut as we possibly can. Okay, here is mine all trimmed up. Now let's have a look. And now we're up to our satin stitches. So the first satin stitch is going to come around and go around all of this beautiful applique work. Now that the first colour is done, we can move on to the next colour, which in our case is the gorgeous peony pinkish purple colour. Now, what you will notice as you stitch this out is that it's going to come past that initial stitching line. That's because of the sucking in. But because we've used wash away thread, that's really not an issue for us. And then our last stitching is going to be in the beautiful wine colour. Okay, so now all of our stitching is complete, and I'm just going to come through and bring that down just to make it easier for myself. So my stitching is all finished. Next thing that I want to do is put together the quilting, and to do that I am turning my hoop over, and I have my thicker wadding which I'm going to lay over the back of the design, just making sure that it covers it. And then we are going to stitch the colourway to hold down that wadding. Once you've got the wadding held down, you are going to come through and trim it away close to that stitching edge. Remembering, of course, that we are using the wash away thread. That's all trimmed now. I'm going to take my backing fabric and place it over the top. So once I've made sure those are all laid down on top, I can come through and put my hoop on. Now each time I just need to make sure that the backing fabric does not move away. If you are lazy like me, it is easy to be tempted to just use plain white thread. Trust me when I tell you, you will be saving time long term if instead you come through and you use the wash away thread at this point. We're going to remove our hoop, or let our hoop move back to the correct position, and then stitch that down. And you'll be amazed by just how much the design does suck in. Probably around 3 millimeters, 2 to 3 millimeters on each side of the design. Once that stitching is complete, we are now up to the quilting. So I am going to load on a white thread because I want the quilting to match my background fabric. I'll only be quilting on the white areas. And I'm not sure that I threaded that correctly, so please just excuse me for doing that again. And can now come through and do those quilting stitches. And that is our block finished. Let's move on to the next step. So here I have my 4 completed blocks of block 2. And the final part of this design is the center circle, and this covers up the joins in the center and is appliqued onto the 4 blocks once your stitching has been completed. So we're going to start with colorway 1, which is the decorative design. And the second colorway we are going to stitch out to show us where we are going to place our first piece of applique fabric. At this stage you should have your applique fabric all pressed and ready to go over the space. And take that applique fabric, make sure it's smoothed, and I like to make sure I'm using up the least amount of fabric possible, which is why I don't pre-cut. I find that I can be a little bit more stingy by not pre-cutting. So I'm coming through, I've tacked that fabric down, and then I'm going to move my hoop forward and trim away the excess fabric. I want to trim away between each colour because it gives a much better looking design at the end. As always, I am using my curved tip scissors to do the trimming, and I love that they are small enough to get in and yet powerful enough to not damage and hack the fabric away. Now, the other thing that you need to be careful of when you've got stitching already laid down is that your scissors don't pick up any of those little stitches. So just be aware of that, and you'll be able to feel as you go through. I apologize for looking at my hand. Sometimes you just gotta do. And the next colorway, which is the first, second, third, fourth colorway, is going to be to show us where we are going to put our second piece of applique fabric. So we stitch the outline. Once again, this applique fabric should be pressed, and if it's truly lightweight, it's worth starching it at the same time. So I've taken my applique fabric and stitched the next colorway. I love these bubbles, they're just so cute. But remember, one of the joys of this quilt is that you can use whatever colorways you want, and you can do every block different and have it be a real colourful type of a quilt. I love the idea of that, but I am just not confident enough in colour to do that myself. So I'm going to come through once again, trim away all of my excess, And then we get to move on to the satin stitching. Now, for me, the first satin stitching is going to be this beautiful aubergine colour. Before we move on to the deep pink. And, oh, no, I lied. Oh, I'm not doing well today. There was one last applique piece. Once again, stitch the outline, lay the fabric over. Thrilled that I get to use a piece that I cut away from the applique on the larger blocks. So trim that away as well. Then I can start my stitching. Can't believe I led you astray like that, guys. I do apologise. Okay. Now we're going to start our applique stitching, and it's just basic stitching, so I'm going to come through and actually speed through this a little bit so that I'm not wasting so much of your time. And now we are on to the last colour, which is in the dark teal for my design, and it is stitching around the block. So it's doing that applique and then of course the beautiful finish to all that I have on all of my applique designs. Once we've done that, we are going to move over to placing this onto block 2 and finishing off the entire block. And as you can see, the stitching on this is just beautiful. The colours really do make it, and that background open weave stitch is just perfect for this block. Once you've completed your stitching, run around the circle with a running stitch, either by machine or by hand, And then I'm just going to come through, and the only thing I want to do is make sure that I don't pick up these threads as I trim. So just roughly trim, and then use that running stitch to gently pull in around our circle. Always easiest at the start and the end, and then we just have to help move things around when we get to the other side. And what this does is just gives you a really beautiful circle with very few edges that we can now come through, place our center block on the center, and either hand or machine stitch that on to complete. And here you can see our completed block. I think this looks absolutely stunning. You can see we've got the applique pieces, we've got our joins, and it's all finished off with that circle. I hope you've enjoyed this as much